About 60 years ago, Honorable Roman Pucinski, the chief investigator of the Select Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives for the investigation into the Katyn forest massacre, put his final touches on the Katyn report. This report, known as the Madden Committee report, to this day remains one of the most comprehensive reports on the murder of the Polish officers in the Katyn forest. During his lifetime, Honorable Roman Pucinski did not see justice served with respect to the Katyn crime. The U.S. Congress did not act on the recommendations of the Madden Committee. Today, his daughter, Aurelia Pucinski, came to the Capitol Hill to once again call upon the leaders to take action with respect to the Katyn injustice, because the moral calculus with respect to Katyn has not been worked out to this day. I am very pleased to introduce Honorable Aurelia Pucinski.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, President Spula, Maria, President. I am thrilled to be here. It brings back very fond memories, not only of growing up in Washington, but also spending an entire lifetime listening to my father talk about the Katyn Forest Massacre and not only his work on the investigation, but the need for all of us to keep remembering it and to make somebody do something about it. On May 4th in 1943, General Sikorski, then the Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile in London, sent a most secret letter to President Roosevelt. He thanked the President for the kind interest shown to our problem during the past few days and added how much he regretted the decision of the Soviet Union to suspend diplomatic relations after the Poles' invitation to the International Red Cross to investigate the circumstances of the death of thousands of Polish officers recently brought to light by the Germans. Sikorski added, "I trust that you realize that this action on the part of the Soviet government was not a sudden or isolated one, but the climax of a sequel of events all directed against the Polish nation and the Polish government. I fear that what the Soviet government wants is a Polish communist government which would offer them Poland as a Soviet satellite state." History proved him right. Indeed, as we study the massacre of the Katyn forest, the tragic loss of lives is but one side of the same coin that damns not only the Soviets, but also those in the American and British governments who knew about Katyn, knew that open knowledge of it would disrupt their own plans, and purposely and deliberately kept the horror of that forest from public scrutiny until 1952, when the Congress of these United States held hearings that proved conclusively that the Soviets, not the Nazis, were responsible for the killing, and brought attention of the world to the fact that not only those bodies were hidden from view, but the knowledge of the crime was as well. We know that Sikorski told President Roosevelt about Katyn. We know that Roosevelt and Churchill knew about Katyn. We know that the Swiss Protective Service knew about Katyn because Colonel Van Vliet reported his trip to the site at the hands of the Germans while he was still a prisoner of war. We know the Soviets broke off diplomatic relations with the government in exile in 1943, in which Mr. Molotov accused the Poles of reaching an understanding with Hitler and used that as an excuse to break off all relations. And that in Moscow in 1943, Pravda and TASS reported that the Poles were collaborating with Hitler, that the behavior was provocative, and that the Sikorski government was assisting the German occupiers in covering up their crimes against the Russian and Polish people. We know that Stalin himself ordered the execution of the Polish officers and reserve officers because, as my father stated in 1965, as early as 1940, the Soviet communists had already cast the die for occupation of what are now known as the captive nations of Europe. Stalin knew that these Polish officers constituted the heart of resistance to the plans to take over Poland after the war. The execution of these Polish army officers in the Katyn forest by the Soviets constitutes the most brutal act of genocide against the leadership of a nation ever recorded in history. We know that somehow the Soviets were assigned at the Nuremberg trials to prosecute any war crimes in the area of Katyn, and that they indicted the Germans, but that no competent evidence was ever produced and the indictment was dropped. We know that in 1944, Professor Douglas Savory rose in the Parliament of London and called on his colleagues to do something about it, and he was advised by his colleagues in the House of Commons not to say anything because the appropriate time and place was 7 years ago at Nuremberg. We know that the free world has never held the Soviets accountable. We know that when in Congress in 1952, they issued a strong plea to cite the Soviet Union in the International Court of Justice, the State Department refused to do it. We know that during World War II, there were those in the State Department who felt the disclosure of the Soviet guilt in Katyn would hurt our relationship with our ally, the Russians. We know that in the meeting in Yalta, in which the borders of Poland were negotiated with Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill knew full well that they were betraying Poland, an ally for whom England had even gotten into the war and to whom both leaders had categorically promised border and political independence. In the record of the executive session of the Congressional Committee in 1952, General Brigadier Clark, former assistant to the staff of G2, was surprised when asked how General Bissell got to be the head of G2. And he said General Bissell had no prior intelligence experience, but somehow wound up running the intelligence service of the Army. And in fact, General Clark testified that there were rumors that General Bissell had left an assignment in India under a cloud, and that the Van Vliet report was dictated in the presence of the G2, which is the general, which was completely out of line and a surprise to everybody, that the person would come in to do it rather than submit a written report. We know that the Polish Red Cross reported to the International Red Cross in April of 1943 that there was a large common grave in Katyn, that the bodies were apparently Polish officers killed by bullets from revolvers, and that the papers found among the corpses indicated that the murders took place about March or April of 1940. We know that Congressman George Dondero of Michigan wrote to the Pentagon in October of 1949 and asked for a copy of any report filed by Colonel Van Vliet. We know that General Leroy Bourbon, Director of Intelligence at the Pentagon, responded to the congressman, quote, "The Intelligence Department has recently acquired a report on the subject, which was partially based on Lieutenant Colonel Van Vliet's observations of the German exhumation of the Polish graves at Katyn in 1943. The report is classified and therefore cannot be released at the time." Dondero went crazy. So why is it classified? And he was told the report contains highly sensitive information, the premature disclosure of which would be extremely unwise in view of the current international situation. Dondero was then told later in 1950 that the report the Pentagon was talking about earlier wasn't really the Van Vliet report, it was something else. We know that when Colonel Van Vliet was liberated, he went immediately to his Army supervisors at the closest front and told them that he had been in Katyn. And we know from General Clark's testimony in executive session that the Van Vliet's superior officer, General Collins, told him, "Heavens, you have to get back to the First Army and get back to the War Department as rapidly as possible," and just booted him back to the First Army. But the reason it was handled special was because it was just a hot potato that he was dealing with. And we know that Van Vliet did return to Washington and immediately make his report. We know from General Clark's testimony at the executive session that there were personnel working in G2, including he named William Johnson and his wife Annette Fox Johnson, who were left of center, and that those persons were openly promulgating pro-Soviet feelings in the U.S. during the period 43 to 45, and that they were not alone, that there were many pro-Soviets in the War Department, the State Department, and in G2. We know that a Colonel Yeaton met with the Polish General Anders in Moscow in September of 1941, and that General Anders was, quote, "most concerned with the cream of his own staff and his best officers and non-commissioned officers because he hadn't had a word from them and hadn't been able to locate them." We know from testimony in the executive session in 1952 that Colonel Yeaton continued that he had a file on the missing Polish officers that was given to G2, and that General Bissell would have had access to it when he met with Colonel Van Vliet. We know from his testimony in executive session in 1952 that John Ehrman, who was on General Bissell's staff at G2, never saw the Van Vliet report, felt it was entirely possible that General Bissell sent the Van Vliet report to the State Department with a top secret courier, that it would have been against regulations to do that without a transmittal or a receipt, but it could have happened, and that when General Bissell in his testimony indicated that G2 was sending anything received in connection with war crimes or atrocities to an agency holding it for the War Crimes Commission, that he, Ehrman, Bissell's assistant, had never heard of any such agency. Ehrman continued, Bissell was just cozy as hell with everything he did. I think it is possible that this thing, having come up in his own mind, he'd had something more on the subject, and it was just, quote, hot as heck. We know that Mildred Mears, in her secret testimony before an executive session, said that she was called to General Bissell's office and that she didn't know why the report was labeled top secret by General Bissell, that it was of a political nature. Ms. Mears also recalled writing a letter later in August of 1945 in which General Bissell transmitted information to the State Department on the Katyn report, and the report was to supplement the material from the Van Vliet report, but somehow none of these letters in their original, with the routing to show where they went, can be found. My father thought it was very hard to believe that General Bissell, handling thousands of documents, could have dictated a letter in August in which he, by himself, magically recalled the date of the May 25th letter without checking a file card, a document, something. And yet none of that has ever been made available. We know from his own testimony in 1952 that General Bissell called Mrs. Mears up to take the report, even though she wasn't his regular secretary, and that he ensured that Mrs. Mears knew the security classification of her work with Colonel Van Vliet, and that when it was completed, he classified it top secret. So we know that General Bissell, before he even talked to Van Vliet, was going to classify this top secret and tell his staff what to do with it. And what they did with it was make one rough copy. Now, they made one rough copy because Mrs. Mears would type a rough copy and then she would give it to the author and expect it to be edited, corrected, approved. In fact, it was the rough copy that was eventually signed by Colonel Van Vliet. Now, when Mr. Mitchell, the chief counsel of the committee, asked General Bissell in his testimony why and to what extent the Van Vliet report fell into the category of top secret in May of 1945, which was actually after the Germans had surrendered, General Bissell replied, well, we had the Yalta Conference. We know that the State Department could not find the Van Vliet report or any receipt for it. We know that they couldn't find the Van Vliet report to the Swiss protecting power on his treatment by the Germans. We know that the file copy of the letter is missing, that the original of the file was missing, and that the file copies were missing all of the routing and all of the documents that came up. We know that the relationship of the Van Vliet report and its timing submitted to General Bissell on the 22nd and perhaps the 23rd of May of 1945 and sent over, apparently by General Bissell, according to him, to the State Department on the 25th of May 1945 coincided exactly with the opening of the United Nations Organization talks in San Francisco. We know that the FCC and the VOA smothered talk about Katyn through various nefarious means by challenging the licenses of foreign language broadcasters to curb the editorial content of Polish broadcasters and Ukrainian broadcasters. They kept those licenses on 30-day temporary licenses. The law provided for 2-year licenses for radio stations. They kept those licenses on 30-day temporary licenses on purpose to have leverage over the broadcasters and to make sure that the topic of Katyn was never mentioned in America. We know that in an executive session before the Congress in 1952, 2 gentlemen explained that the Office of Censorship was being taken over by the FCC and that it was not appropriate and it was not even authorized by the Act. And we know that those attending the San Francisco conference to establish the United Nations were very concerned that any knowledge of the Katyn Forest Massacre and the Russians' part in that would have seriously undermined the operation of the organization of the United Nations. General Bissell explained away all of this by saying he thought he sent it over to the State Department. Nobody ever had any record of that. My father said that Van Vliet's statement when he was taken to Katyn was shown mass graves. He accorded the treatment a prisoner of war. The statement was received by the State Department from the American location in Bern, Switzerland in 1945. No one knows what happened to that either. The records indicate that one copy was sent to the Provost Marshal General's office and to G1. Nobody has a record of that. The War Crimes College looked for all the Katyn forged records so that they could use it as a class study. They couldn't find anything. And we know that important people and agencies of the United States government knew about the Katyn Forest Massacre, not only from the German broadcast in 1943, but through intercepted messages, and in 1944 from the Swiss Protective Power, and in 1945 because Van Vliet himself reported it. We know that Van Vliet met with Bissell on May 23rd, and that on May 25th the conference to start the United Nations got underway. We know that all of the information about Katyn and the Soviet perpetrators was withheld from the American people and was in fact actively shut down. We believe that the borders of Poland, the agreements in Yalta, the government of Poland, and the actual foundation of the United Nations would have been vastly different if the United States government had been candid and open with the citizens of this nation and the world. Instead, to get a devil's deal to keep Russia in the war with Japan, Roosevelt, the State Department, the War Department, the FCC, the VOA, and other agencies covered up the massacre at Katyn, a cover-up that resulted in entire nations being held hostage to the will of communism and the brutality of Soviet domination. And we are now left to wonder how different the world would have been if the leaders of the United States had done what was right and not what they felt was expedient. We wonder how different the lives would have been if pro-Soviet sympathizers had not been tolerated in the leadership of this nation. And we will always wonder how many families were destroyed by the killing at Katyn and by the decades of Soviet domination. And we must wonder if America's leaders have the moral courage to demand justice for the victims of Katyn and the records which will document the horror. Finally, we must all wonder if the leadership of this great nation can learn from the lesson of the silence of Katyn and dedicate itself to a clear, transparent, and open communication with the people they serve. We understand that security was, in 1945, as is now, a critical reality. We do not seek to lose the protection of national security interests, but after the fact, to keep secrets can never be acceptable in a free society.